experienced having these huge things in their backyard. An article by Robert Bryce on why the wind industry is full of hot air and costing you big bucks, and an article from the Los Angeles Times on wind farms, and another article from February 2nd in the Globe about how a town has turned off wind but opted for solar energy.
Objection.
Madam President, I thank you. I notice the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
The order was 10 minutes each. Senator from Florida.
Madam President.
Senator from Florida.
I'd like to speak not
You're in a quorum call.
Madam President, I ask consent that we lift the quorum call.
Without objection.
Madam President, we have a vote coming up at 12 o'clock. I'd like to speak as to the vote.
Senators recognized.
Thank you. Madam President, we are going to vote on Judge Jordan, some pronounce it Jordan, Cuban-American federal district judge who has been named by the President to go to the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals. Judge Jordan came out of the Judiciary Committee unanimously. Judge Jordan, as Senator Rubio and I spoke on Monday, the two of us in a bipartisan way that do all of the selection of our federal district judges, and it's all done in a bipartisan way. And in this case, with Judge Jordan being elevated to the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals, again, done in a bipartisan way. And indeed, the motion for cloture on the nomination, that is to stop all debate on the nomination, was passed at a 5:30 vote Monday afternoon by a vote of 89 to 5. And so at noon today, we're going to vote on the actual confirmation, which is the second step in the process after the President nominates, the Senate confirms. And Judge Jordan, by our vote today, which I expect will be rather overwhelmingly bipartisan, and Judge Jordan will ascend to the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals as the first Hispanic judge on that Court of Appeals. Now, I think it's instructive that we could have done all of this Monday at about 6 o'clock after the vote had occurred 89 to 5 to cut off debate. And yet the Senate rules allow even one senator, if they object, which one senator did, object to the waiving of post the cloture, cutting off debate. The Senate rules said that there can be up to 30 hours of debate before then the matter at hand is voted on. Well, of course, with a vote of 89 to 5, it's pretty well determined, especially since Senator Rubio and I were the ones that were bringing this judge to the attention of the Senate. And yet here we are. It is now Wednesday at noon that it is going to take us to get to this judge. This is illustrative of how the Senate is not working. For whatever reason, the senator who objected, which, by the way, it's my understanding that the senator had no objection to the judge, it's some other extraneous matter, and therefore wanted to slow up the gears and throw rocks into the gears of the Senate so that what could have been dispensed with on Monday evening at 6 o'clock is now taking all the way till noontime on Wednesday after the 30 hours has run. Well, for the Senate to function, it's got to have a measure of trust among senators. It has to be bipartisan. The two leaders have to get along. And in the process, a lot of the work is done by unanimous consent, with the consent of the two leaders, the Democratic leader and the Republican leader. But when things get too hyper-partisan or too ideologically rigid, then that's when the whole process, the mechanism, goes out of kilter. And it is just another illustration in this time of an election cycle for president, where things are highly sensitive from a political, partisan, and ideological standpoint, that here a judge that is warmly embraced by both sides for his confirmation is getting it held up. I will just close by recalling the reason that Judge Jordan got a vote of 89-5 is he has had a stellar record as a federal district judge. He has, over the course of his career, clerked when he came out of law school for a judge on the 11th Circuit, and then clerked for Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, went back and was an assistant U.S. attorney, and then went to the bench and has been there for over a decade. And this is the kind of people that we want to have in the judicial branch of our government. I commend him on behalf of Senator Rubio. The two of us have just been in a meeting all morning in duties of another committee, the Intelligence Committee, and I commend to the Senate, on behalf of Senator Rubio and me, Judge Jordan, to be confirmed for the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals. Madam President, I yield the floor.
Senator from Nebraska.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, I rise today to take a few minutes to comment on the bill that the Senate is considering, will soon be considering, to state why I currently oppose the bill in its current form. I'm speaking of the bill that we oftentimes refer to as the transportation bill. I do think that this bill does some good things. I supported it coming out of the EPW committee. It had a very sound bipartisan support in that committee. But there is a serious concern with the bill, a concern for all of us. Specifically, there's a provision in the bill that is what I would call an earmark. However, it's often referred to by our rule as a congressionally directed spending item. Let me again say, pure and simple, it's an earmark. And that is why, even though I supported the bill in committee, I did feel very strongly about that provision, and I felt compelled to vote against proceeding to the bill, and that's why I'm here today filing an amendment. This provision changes the purpose of an earmark that was included in the previous highway bill. And then the language goes on to do a second thing. It newly directs the money back to the same state where the earmark project would have occurred. that being the state of Nevada. Let me just repeat that. It takes an unspent earmark from a previous highway bill in Nevada, and it replaces it with yet another earmark to the state of Nevada. I'll go into further detail. First, the bill identifies any unobligated balances associated with this earmark. The bill reads, quote, any unobligated balances of amounts required to be allocated to a state by section such and such of the safety lieu, unquote, bill. So in other words, it goes to the unobligated balances, which was an earmark. If you go back to the previous highway bill, this section, 1307D1, well, it's an earmark in that previous bill. But it doesn't stop there. It doesn't stop by rescinding that earmark. It goes on to say, the text of the bill we're considering, that this money, quote, shall instead be made available to such state, the state of Nevada. So we've rescinded the earmark, but then we've said that the money goes back to the same state. In other words, the earmarked money is now directed by law, if this were to pass, back to the state where the project was to be built. Now, Madam President, two wrongs don't make a right. If several $1 million are sitting idly by in an account and we want to rescind those funds, then that's pretty straightforward. We just direct the rescission of those funds and don't earmark it to a specific state. If we're going to start the game, though, of earmarking, which I believe is what this does, well, obviously, there'd be a lot of other senators who believe in earmarks who say, I want my turn also. I don't happen to believe in earmarks, but some of my colleagues would say, well, look, if you can do this for one state, you can do it for my state. So if every state can direct spending, specific spending to their own state, then we're right back in the business of earmarking. Now, I won't necessarily speak to the purposes behind the change in the project, although it's pretty clear from newspaper articles out of Nevada that this money is going to be used for a road project. I'll leave the defense of the policy to others. What I will say is that the provision, without a shadow of doubt, meets the definition of an earmark under Rule 44 of the Standing Rules of the Senate. The bottom line is that the provision in the bill will direct federal funds to a single state. Rule 44 of our standing rules, the standing rules of the Senate, as we all know, defines what is a congressionally directed spending item, and I'll quote that rule. A provision or report language included primarily at the request of a senator providing, authorizing, or recommending a specific amount of discretionary budget authority, credit authority, or spending authority for a contract, loan, loan guarantee, grant, loan authority, or other expenditure with or to an entity or targeted to a specific state. Then it goes on to say locality or congressional district other than through a statutory or administrative formula-driven or competitive award process. Well, there was a reason why that language is included in that rule, and it's what's happening here. If you could just simply direct funds to your state, then like I said previously, we're back in the earmarking business. Furthermore, the bill before the Senate was written based on the understanding that there'd be no earmarks. Everybody's running around saying there's no earmarks in the bill. Everybody's been very public about saying that. That posture was well received. It was commended, in fact. It was commended, in my judgment, in part because many understood that a highway bill that included earmarks just simply wouldn't pass. In other words, a no earmark policy was necessary to get this bill done. So at the moment, I am very concerned that we will have damaged the Senate bill, our legislative process, and hurt the chances of a highway bill getting done. I think the highway bill makes a lot of sense for our country, but we've got to solve this kind of problem. And I can't support the bill with an earmark for one state, the state of Nevada. Even the President of the United States has weighed in on this. He's taken a very strong stand. He said, and I'm quoting, "If a bill comes to my desk with earmarks inside, I will veto it," unquote. This highway bill is far too important for us to jeopardize its passage or to invite a veto by the President just because the provision is very hard to find and buried at page 463. So, Madam President, I think there is a way to move forward on the highway bill, at least as far as this is concerned. I think our state and local leaders are hoping we pass a highway bill. There's a lot of good things that can happen with it, but this has to come out of the bill. This needs to change, and my hope is that the Senate will pass my amendment to do just that. Thank you, Madam President. I yield the floor. I note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
Madam President,
Senator from Vermont.
Madam President, I ask consent to call the quorum be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Madam President, I ask consent to speak for up to 5 minutes as though in morning business.
Without objection.
Madam President, today the Senate is finally going to vote, I believe in just a few minutes, on the nomination of Judge Alaberto Jordan of Florida, to fill a judicial emergency vacancy in the 11th Circuit. Judicial emergency. Now, he was passed out of Senate Judiciary Committee unanimously. Every member of the committee voted for him. Within a day, Senator Bill Nelson had got it cleared. On the Democratic side, every Democratic senator said they're ready to vote, but he's been held up for 4 months by a Republican filibuster that was broken by an 89-5 vote on Monday. And even after an 89-5 vote to let him go forward, they insisted on 2 days more of delay, so the Senate's finally going to have a vote. Now, Judge Jordan is by any measure the kind of consensus nominee who should have been confirmed within days of being reported unanimously. He has a strong support of his home state senators, Senator Nelson, a Democrat, Senator Rubio, a Republican, and yet he's been delayed for months. They prevented the Senate from voting on Judge Jordan's nomination in October, prevented us from voting on him in November, prevented us from voting on him in December, prevented us from voting on him in January, and then when we finally voted to stop the filibuster, it took another 2 days of delay. This superbly qualified nominee will be the first Cuban-American on the 11th Circuit. We should have, with pride, 4 months ago, had him confirmed unanimously by the Senate. His record of achievement is beyond reproach. The only statements about the nominee here on the floor haven't been against him. They were by me, by Senator Nelson, and even by the Republican senators who spoke. Everybody described him as qualified and worthy of confirmation. Now, the stalling, the delays, the obstruction, even the votes against ending the filibuster may have been about something else or some collateral issue, but they should not have marred this process. They should not have complicated this nomination. They should not delay this moment when Cuban Americans will see one of their own elevated to the second highest court in the land. Now, I do appreciate and I want to thank the Hispanics for a fair judiciary and the Hispanic National Bar Association for the attention and the help they've given this important nomination. And I'd say to the Hispanics for a fair judiciary and the Hispanic National Bar Association, you're finally going to see your work rewarded. Now, I support the rights of every senator to act as they wish, but the junior senator from Kentucky held up this nominee for his own purposes. You're talking about some amendment they have. Well, you don't amend a nomination. You don't amend a nomination. So, and I wonder how you explain why the kind of obstruction we're seeing on the floor. The American people, a Florida lawyer and former prosecutor, was quoted in the Orlando Sentinel saying it's good reason why Congress's approval rating is 10%. He continued, politics should have no place in the nomination and confirmation of excellent jurors like Judge Jordan. It shouldn't happen. We need qualified judicial nominees on the bench big time. But, Mr. President, I can tell you right now, every Vermonter would agree with this. Especially this kind of senseless obstruction comes at a great cost to the millions of Americans living in Florida, Georgia, and Alabama, whether Republicans or Democrats. They're all affected by this judicial emergency vacancy. So I am going to vote with pride for Judge Alaberto Jordan. He's proven through his long career on the bench and as a prosecutor to be a public servant of tremendous quality and integrity. And I congratulate him and his family, Senator Nelson and Senator Rubio, the people of Florida this confirmation. Mr. President, I yield the floor. I ask consent that my full remarks be printed in the record as though in executive session.
Without objection. Morning business is closed. Under the previous order, the Senate will proceed to executive session to resume consideration of the following nomination, which the clerk will report.
Nomination, the Judiciary, Alaberto Jose Jordan of Florida to be United States Circuit Judge.
Under the previous order, there will be 2 minutes of debate equally divided and controlled in the usual form.
Mr. President, I'm advised that there's nobody else who wishes to speak, and my statement will be in this executive session, so I would consent to yield back any time and ask for the ayes and nays.
Without objection. The question is on the confirmation of the nomination. Is there a sufficient second? Appears to be. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka, Mr. Alexander, Ms. Ayotte, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Baucus, Mr. Begich.
Sheriff, I understand you're doing the retrofit.
Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bingaman. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Bozeman. Mrs. Boxer. Mr. Brown of Massachusetts. Mr. Brown of Ohio. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Chambliss. Mr. Coates. Mr. Coburn. Mr. Cochran. Ms. Collins. Mr. Conrad. Mr. Coons. Mr. Corker. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Dement. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi. Mrs. Feinstein. Mr. Franken. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Grassley. Mrs. Hagan. Mr. Harkin. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Heller. Mr. Hoven. Mrs. Hutchison. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Inouye. Mr. Isaacson. Mr. Johans. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota. Mr. Kerry. Mr. Kirk. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Cole. Mr. Kyle. Ms. Landrieu. Mr. Lautenberg. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee. Mr. Levin. Mr. Lieberman. Mr. Lugar. Mr. Manchin. Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson of Nebraska, Mr. Nelson of Florida, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, Mr. Reed of Nevada, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Snow, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Vitter, Mr. Warner, Mr. Webb, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden. Senators voting in the affirmative: Barrasso, Begich, Brown of Ohio, Durbin, Enzi, Gillibrand, Hagan, Inhofe, Isaacson, Kyle, Leahy, Merkley, Nelson of Florida, Shelby, and Tester. Mr. Lee voted in the negative. Mr. Franken, aye. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Schumer, aye. Ms. Snow. Ms. Snow, aye. Mrs. Murray. Mrs. Murray, aye. Mr. Reed of Nevada, aye. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Wyden, aye. Mr. Vitter, no. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Whitehouse, aye. Mr. Kerry. Mr. Kerry, aye. Mr. Burr. Mr. Burr, aye. Mr. Conrad. Mr. Conrad, aye. Mr. Johans. Mr. Johans, aye. Mr. Rockefeller. Mr. Rockefeller, aye. Mr. Coons. Mr. Coons, aye. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Toomey, no. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blumenthal, aye. Mr. Inoue. Mr. Inoue, aye. Mr. Brown of Massachusetts, aye. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bennett, aye. Mr. Webb. Mr. Webb, aye. Mrs. Hutchison. Mrs. Hutchison, aye. Mr. Heller. Mr. Heller, aye. Ms. Klobuchar. Ms. Klobuchar, aye. Mr. Dement, no. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, aye. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Cornyn, aye. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Grassley, aye. Mrs. McCaskill, aye. Mr. Pryor, aye. Mr. Warner. Mr. Warner, aye. Mr. Rubio, aye. Mr. Cole. Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Nelson. Mr. Nelson of Nebraska, aye. Ms. Stabenow. Ms. Stabenow, aye. Mr. Coates. Mr. Coates, aye. Mr. Paul. Yes. Mr. Paul, aye. Mr. Coburn. Mr. Coburn, aye.
File today, vote on Friday in the House.
Mr. Lugar. Mr. Lugar, aye. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Manchin, aye. Mr. Moran. Mr. Moran, aye. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Cardin, aye. Ms. Collins, aye. Mr. Alexander. Mr. Alexander, aye. Ms. Ayotte, aye. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Menendez, aye. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Sanders, aye. Mr. McConnell. Mr. McConnell, aye. Mr. Corker. Mr. Corker, aye. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, aye. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Blunt, no. Ms. Mikulski. Ms. Mikulski, aye. Mr. Cochran. Mr. Cochran, aye. Mr. Portman, aye. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wicker, aye. Mr. Risch. Mr. Risch, aye. Mr. Bingaman. Mr. Bingaman, aye. Mrs. Shaheen. Mrs. Shaheen, aye. Mr. Levin. Mr. Levin, aye. Mr. Udall. Mr. Udall of New Mexico, aye. Mr. Udall of Colorado, aye. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Hoven, aye. Mr. Casey. Mr. Casey, aye. Ms. Cantwell, aye. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Hatch, aye. Mr. Crapo, aye. Mr. Carper. Mr. Carper, aye. Mr. Akaka, aye. Mr. Sessions. Mr. Sessions, aye. Mr. Bozeman, aye. Mr. Graham. Mr. Graham, aye. Mr. Lieberman. Mr. Lieberman, aye. Mr. Chambliss. Mr. Chambliss, aye.
Absolutely. Well, put it on the deck.
Ms. Landrieu, aye. Mr. Reed. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, aye. Mr. Lautenberg, aye. Mr. Thune. Mr. Thune, aye. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Roberts, aye. Mr. Harkin. Mr. Harkin, aye. Mr. McCain. Mr. McCain, aye. Mr. Baucus. Mr. Baucus, aye. Mrs. Boxer. Mrs. Boxer, aye. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Feinstein, aye. Ms. Murkowski. Ms. Murkowski, aye.
Is there any member of the chamber of the Senate that wishes to vote or change his or her vote? If not, the ayes are 94, the nays are 5, and the nomination is confirmed. Under the previous order, the motion to reconsider is considered made and laid upon the table, and the President will immediately be notified of the Senate's action, and the Senate will resume legislative session.
Mr. President.
Senator from Rhode Island.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to a period of morning business until 3 p.m., with senators permitted to speak for up to 10 minutes each.
Is there objection? Without objection, so ordered.
Note the absence of quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
President.
The senator from Vermont.
Mr. President, I would ask unanimous consent that I and Senators Tom Udall.
We're in a quorum call.
I would ask that the quorum call be vitiated.
Without objection.
And I would ask unanimous consent that I and other senators, including Tom Udall and the presiding officer, and Senator Whitehouse, be permitted to speak for the next 60 minutes.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I think that here, Mr. President, can we have order, please?
Yes. Order, please.
Mr. President, I fear that one of the major issues that not only faces our country but faces our planet is not getting the kind of serious debate and discussion that it needs here in the United States Senate. And that is the planetary crisis of global warming, what its impact is having now in our country and in other countries throughout the world, and how, in fact, we can address this enormous crisis. Now, I understand politically that some of my colleagues do not believe that global warming is real, and they do not really think that there is much that our country should or can do to address this crisis. I understand that, but with all due respect, I strongly disagree with that position and believe that in terms of the future of our planet, the lives of our kids and our grandchildren, that is a very wrong-headed position and could lead to enormous problems for our country and for the rest of the world. But the truth of the matter is, Mr. President, the real debate about global warming is not whether other members of the Senate disagree with me or with Senator Udall. The issue is what the scientific community, the people who have studied this issue for years, in fact believe. And as I think you understand, the overwhelming consensus in our country and around the world from the scientific community is A, global warming is real, and B, that to a very significant degree, global warming is man-made. Now, that is not my position, not just what I say or what other members of the Senate say. Far more importantly, it is what leading scientists all over the world are saying. The National Academies of Science in this country, joined by academies of science in the United Kingdom, Italy, Mexico, Canada, France, Japan, Russia, Germany, China, India, Brazil, South Africa have said, this is their statement, National Academies of Scientists. They have said, quote, climate change is happening even faster than previously estimated, and the need for urgent action to address climate change is now indisputable, end of quote. So it is fine for radio talk show hosts to have their view. Frankly, I think it is more significant that the scientific community from all over the world is in agreement, and let me repeat what they say: climate change is happening even faster than previously estimated, and the need for urgent action to address climate change is now indisputable. Mr. President, 18 scientific societies, including the American Geophysical Union and the American Association for the Advancement of Science, said, and I quote, "Observations throughout the world make it clear that climate change is occurring, and rigorous scientific research demonstrates that the greenhouse gases emitted by human activities are the primary driver." That is not me. That is 18 scientific societies, including the American Geophysical Union and the American Association for the Advancement of Scientists. And they continue, "These conclusions are based on multiple independent lines of evidence, and contrary assertions are inconsistent with an objective assessment of the vast body of peer-reviewed science," end quote. But it's not only the scientific community. It is agencies of the United States government who have to deal or worry about the impact of global warming. The Department of Defense says, and I quote, "Climate change is an accelerant of instability," end of quote. What they worry about is that as the planet warms, as floods occur, as drought occurs, that you're going to see migrations of people, you're going to see countries fighting over limited natural resources, whether it is farmland or whether it is water. And from a Department of Defense perspective, they say, and I repeat, quote, "Climate change is an accelerant of instability," end of quote. That's the U.S. Department of Defense, not Bernie Sanders. The CIA, our intelligence agency, says, quote, "Climate change could have significant geopolitical impacts around the world, contributing to poverty, environmental degradation, and the further weakening of fragile governments, as well as food and water scarcity," end of quote. That's not a United States Senator here on the floor. That is the Central Intelligence Agency, whose business it is to gather and assess threats to our country. Interestingly enough, there are segments of the business community who are also speaking out on climate change and global warming for their own reasons. The insurance industry, in a report from the National Association of Insurance Commissioners, found that there is, quote, "broad consensus among insurers that climate change will have an effect on extreme weather events," end of quote. So what you're seeing is scientists all over the world, academic institutions all over the world, governmental agencies right here in the United States of America, including the Department of Defense and the CIA. You're seeing the insurance industry saying global warming is real, it is a real threat to our planet, and it's imperative that we address it. Mr. President, I have more to say on this issue. Some of us will be on the floor for an hour, but I wanted to give the floor over to Senator Tom Udall from New Mexico, who has been certainly a leading advocate in the fight for policies that will reverse global warming and move us